Learning to write characters is an integral part of learning Chinese, but how do you practice writing them? Do you type? Do you write on paper? Or perhaps on the canvas of your mind? Hello and welcome to the Hacking Chinese podcast. In this week's episode, we are going to talk about how to write Chinese characters. And I don't mean how to write the strokes or where the components go, but rather how you practice writing Chinese characters. There are many methods you can use, including obvious ones such as writing on paper or typing on a computer, and these have different effects on your learning. So in this episode, we're going to discuss 7 different ways of practicing writing Chinese characters, with the goal of helping you figure out which ones are suitable for you. This point about finding an approach that works for you is something I mention rather often, and it is important because depending on what your goals are, your approach will be different. So when you listen to this, or when different listeners listen to this episode, the idea is that you will use the knowledge that I provide or the advice that I give, and you will find an approach for you. It will be different depending on who you are and why you are learning Chinese. In this particular case, it matters a lot what your end goal is. So for example, if you don't care about handwriting and just want to be able to type and read, your approach will be different from someone who wants to be able to write everything by hand. So the reason this episode is entitled The Best Way to Practice Learning Chinese Characters is that there isn't one, or there might be one, but it depends on who you are, and I don't know exactly who you are, but I hope that by listening to this and other episodes, you will be able to use the information to figure out what works for you. If you haven't thought that much about the question of handwriting and how important it is, this is something I have explored in several articles and episodes before, and I'll put links to these in the show notes. Most notably, there are 2 recent episodes titled 16 Reasons to Learn to Write Chinese Characters by Hand, and while not all those reasons are good, it is a good exploration and a discussion about why some people want to learn to write by hand. This also implies that there are people who don't want to emphasize handwriting so much, which I think is a healthy approach in general for most people. And this is something we've explored in an episode called Do You Have to Learn to Write Chinese Characters by Hand? And the answer to the question, to put it very briefly, is no, but it can then again depend on your situation. In the following discussion then, I'm going to assume that you follow my advice and learn to write by hand at least some characters, a basic set so you understand how it works, or that you want to learn more characters than that, of course. This discussion will be relevant for everybody who's interested in writing by hand. So let's get started with the first method, which is the most obvious one, namely writing Chinese characters on paper with a pen or pencil. This method has been around for a while, and Chinese characters originally used to be carved into tortoise shells and animal bones, and of course this would be unethical to do today, but essentially from a learner perspective the difference is not very big from doing that and writing on paper. The most notable benefit of writing on paper is that it's very close to what you might want to achieve. Sure, you might be writing characters to learn more about characters or get a feel for how they are structured and so on, but most people write by hand because they think it's useful, in some cases at least, to be able to write characters by hand, and if you do just that, you can be relatively sure that what you learn will be transferable to the real life situation you want to apply it in. This can sometimes be a serious issue, because if you practice writing in an app, for example, this does not guarantee that on a test, for example, you will also be able to write these characters, because the situation might be different, the app works differently, it might give you different hints, etc. So writing on paper is the basic approach, and it guarantees that you will be able to write on paper if that's what you want to do. Writing on paper has downsides though. First, you need paper. You also need something to write with and something to write on, preferably a fairly large, flat surface. This doesn't sound very demanding, but it means there are many situations where you simply can't practice writing Chinese characters because, well, for example, on a bumpy bus, you can't write, or if you don't have your pencil or pad or whatever you're writing on with you, you can't practice. So it eliminates a lot of opportunities to practice writing that would be available if you used a different method. Furthermore, if you just write on paper and you don't have a teacher or anybody else to check your writing, you don't get any feedback. So you could essentially be writing the same thing incorrectly over and over, and you would just cement bad habits. Moving on to method number 2, writing Chinese characters with your finger in your palm. This is an extension and perhaps a simplification of writing with a pen on paper. You simply write with your index finger on your palm. This involves making the same type of movements as when you write this character on paper, and so it's likely to transfer at least somewhat to writing on paper. The most important advantage is that you can do this wherever you are and whenever you have a pocket of time to utilize. For example, you can easily do this when waiting in a line somewhere or when queuing in the supermarket or something like that, where it would be very inconvenient to haul out a piece of paper and put it somewhere flat and write on it. Naturally, this method has drawbacks because you're actually not writing anything and you can't see the final result. Even if you can visualize it in your mind, you're not actually seeing the character that you are writing. This means you're not practicing actual strokes, so your penmanship will suffer if this is your main method. Furthermore, there are many things you don't need to care about when you write in your palm, such as the size of the components and how they are placed in relation to each other. And I don't mean to write beautiful characters here, but for example, if you're a beginner, it's easy sometimes to make the spacing between components too big, which might lead native speakers to thinking that they are two different characters. And so this type of problem will be prevalent if you focus only on writing with your finger in your palm, as opposed to writing, say, on a grid paper where you can see where the components are placed in relation to each other and how big they are. The final drawback is that it's easy to cheat if you do some kind of recall practice. So, for example, if you use flashcards to see if you can recall how to write the character from memory. And this is the type of practice you should do. But like I said, it's easy to cheat, and I don't mean necessarily that you do this deliberately, but since you don't see what you are writing, it's easy to just say, yeah, that's what I wrote, or maybe you just don't check very carefully. And since you haven't actually written anything, you can't really compare, and so you might inadvertently be too lenient with the way you grade yourself. This is an even bigger problem with method number 3, which is writing Chinese characters on the canvas of your mind. This is the next step in the abstraction process, and here you don't even need hands, you just need your mind, and you just think about writing the characters. If you're not very familiar with characters and new to Chinese, you might need to do this on a stroke-by-stroke basis, so you essentially think about writing each stroke. But as you increase your knowledge of building blocks and components, it's easier to just think of which components should go in the character and where, and you kind of just slot them into place. You don't need to actually think about how to write each individual component. Just to give you a simple example, if you're going to write the character Hao this way, it consists of Nu, woman, and Zi, child. So rather than thinking about how to write each of these components, you just think about the components themselves and put them next to each other and visualize what they look like. The advantage of this method is that it's very convenient and fast. You can do it anywhere and you don't actually have to move anything. So as long as you know the components, you can just immediately visualize what characters look like and use this as a way to review how to write them. If you're a beginner listening to this, it might sound very sophisticated and advanced to just visualize components and how they combine to form compounds, but as soon as you have started learning more characters, this is actually not that hard, and it's probably the method that I've used the most over the years. Of course, this method also has downsides, largely the same ones as writing in your palm, but more, because now you're not even moving your finger, you're not doing anything, you're just visualizing writing characters. The method also assumes that you know how to write the components, so you don't have to think about how to write Nu or Zi. You just need to think about which components should go into this character and where they go. Essentially, this method works when you've reached the point where learning a new character is not necessarily hard. You know how characters work and how to learn them, but the problem is more how to keep characters separate from each other and not mixing them up. Let's move on to method number 4, which is writing Chinese characters on screen without feedback. There are many flashcard apps which allow you to use a kind of whiteboard style function where you can just draw things with a stylus or your finger on screen, and then you can compare that to a target model to see how well you did. Functionally, this is very similar to writing with pen on paper. I mean, you can regard your phone as a very expensive paper and a stylus as a pen. So that, from a motor perspective, is roughly the same thing. And of course, the hardware is not identical. So writing with a stylus, for example, is not exactly the same thing as writing with a pencil. And writing with your finger on screen is, again, as we have discussed, not the same thing as holding a pen. This mostly has an impact on penmanship though, so if you're after reviewing how to write the characters, which components they are and where they go and how to write them, this should work fine. Compared to writing on paper, there are some practical benefits because most people do have a smartphone with them. It's easy to fish it out for 2 minutes and write some characters. You don't need to find a hard surface, you don't need to find your pen and so on. If you write Chinese characters on screen a lot, I strongly suggest you buy a mesh tip stylus. These are not expensive, but they make writing much more fun. Next up, we have number 5, writing characters on screen with corrective feedback. So one of the downsides of writing on paper and writing on screen without corrective feedback is that you have to do the comparison yourself. Sometimes we're lazy, we don't have time, etc. So we don't check the character that we write with the model character, or we might miss something when we do that. There are many apps, most notably Scritter, which give you feedback on what you write. So if you put the stroke in the wrong place or write it in the wrong direction, they will just stop you and force you to write it in the correct way. This means that these apps have a huge benefit over writing on paper because you can't write things incorrectly all the time and thereby won't cement bad habits for handwriting. Different apps have put different emphasis on these features, so the basic ones force you to write characters in one specific way according to one standard, but apps like Scritter, which has put a lot of effort into handwriting, allow you to write characters in many different ways that might all be correct, and also allow you to make certain shortcuts that native speakers make all the time and things like that. But the point is that if you use these apps, you will get this type of feedback, so it has a definite advantage over writing on paper. There are downsides, however. These apps usually cost money, for example, and it's also not the same thing as writing on paper. Perhaps the app offers you hints or does other things that isn't the case when you write on paper normally, so you might be practicing in a way that doesn't really transfer to whatever you want to use your handwriting for. So maybe you have a test and you are doing really well in your flashcard app, but when your teacher asks you to write certain characters by hand, you just don't know how to do it. So you need to be really sure that what you're doing, what you're practicing in the app, actually transfers to what you want to use your handwriting for. It's sometimes also easy to cheat, or the apps might be too lenient, and this is something I talked about in an article called About Cheating, Spaced Repetition and Learning Chinese, and of course I'll provide a link in the show notes. This brings us to method number 6, no writing at all, just looking at Chinese characters. This is not really a method, but I do want to mention it here because it is what many students end up doing. Instead of asking yourself, can I write this character from memory, given, for example, the translation in English, the pinyin, or maybe a sentence with the character deleted, you instead ask yourself the question, would I have been able to write this character I'm already looking at if I hadn't seen it first? The problem is that this type of assessment is impossible to do. You simply cannot know if you were able to write something if you already see the character in front of you. Hindsight bias is also a concern here, so after we see the answer, we might be more likely to think that we would have known the answer before we saw it, and so this might lead us to overestimate and cheat on our character reviewing. So don't do this. If your goal is to write characters by hand, simply reading them won't work. This should be obvious to most people who have tried, but I wanted to bring it up here as a method, not because I recommend it, but because it's common and many people do this. Finally, we get to the 7th method, which is only reading and typing Chinese characters. So this has the same base as the previous one, i.e. you are reading, so you are looking at the characters and reviewing them while seeing them. You are not retrieving from memory how to write them by hand, and as I said, this in itself is not enough to learn to write by hand. Still, I and many other educators and teachers recommend that this is what you should do most of the time. This is not because it's the best method to learn to write by hand, but simply because you don't actually need to learn to write all characters by hand, and this is then the best default approach. There are extra steps involved here. First, you need to type by using pinyin, and then you also need to distinguish the right character in some cases where there is more than one character pronounced the same way. This is slightly more active than just reading, and it requires slightly more processing, but as I've said, this is not enough if you want to be able to write by hand. This episode is not the right place to argue or discuss exactly how much handwriting you should do or why it's the case that focusing on handwriting too much is so bad, but I've discussed this in other articles and episodes, most notably Chinese Character Learning for All Students, which I will put a link to in the show notes. So to round this episode off, what I suggest you do is to think about why you are learning Chinese characters, what is your goal, and what do you want to use handwriting for. My recommendation is that you learn to handwrite at least a small basic set of characters, and so then you can consider which of the methods that I've mentioned here applies best to you. And the more advanced you are, the more fancy or more abstract methods you can use. But as a beginner, I think writing on paper is perfectly fine. This will give you a good feel for how characters work and how they are written. And then as you grow more advanced, you can maybe do away with the paper and pencil and use your hand and finger instead, and then gradually you can get rid of those too. Or, I mean, you should keep your hands, but you can write in your mind instead. Naturally, you don't have to choose one of these methods. You should use a combination of them. And so personally, I almost never write by hand on actual paper, but I do use Scritter to maintain my ability to write by hand. I also read and I also type. And sometimes if I want to check something, I might write it with my finger, or I might just think about how to write the characters. So I use most of these methods actually at the same time, and this is where I think most people will end up. But if you are learning a lot of characters and you're in the process of mastering the writing system, it matters a lot which of these methods you use, depending then again on what your goal is. The most important observation is that if you care about writing characters by hand, you need to choose a method that guarantees that that is what you learn. Because if you just stick to, say, reading and typing, or you use an app that gives you lots of hints or things that aren't available for you on a test, for example, you might end up spending lots of time practicing, but then when you try to use the characters or use your handwriting skills in real life, you just don't know how to do it because you've been practicing the wrong way. If you've listened all the way to the end of this episode, I'd be curious to hear about which methods you use or have used for learning to write Chinese characters by hand and what your experience was like. You can always leave a comment directly on the podcast episode, or you can head over to the written article on Hacking Chinese. Thank you for tuning in to the Hacking Chinese podcast. If you like this episode, please share it. More information and inspiration about learning and teaching Chinese can be found at hackingchinese.com. See you in the next episode, and until then, good luck with your studies.